Hi, class. So today we're starting a new unit, right? So what I want you to do is I want you to imagine this. So someone wakes up in the morning, right? She makes breakfast from food that she bought at a grocery store, and keeps in her boxes in her house. She gets on the train to go to work. She works all day in a factory making things other people buy. When her shift's over, she takes the train home. So just modern daily life for a lot of people, right? Especially people maybe in New York or Europe. And it happens today in Los Angeles, in Paris, in Kuala Lumpur. It was also many people's routine in the mid 19th century, so mid 1800s, during the era of the Industrial Revolution. But there was a time before this lifestyle existed. Prior to 1750, there weren't really any grocery stores. Food was not preserved in boxes and cans. The only train was a long line of camels, maybe a camel train going across the desert. Hardly anyone worked for a wage in a factory. That just wasn't common. And as you can see here on the right, it's a bunch of packaged food and medicine, kind of like a helicopter view of what you see in a modern day grocery store, right? Or a CVS, right? So, packaged food and medicine brought to you by the Industrial Revolution. So, all of these changes were part of the Industrial Revolution. And in this unit, we're going to explore how such an enormous transformation to our way of life came about. We're also going to look at how people experienced it and what impact it had. What was the impact was it the same for everyone? What was the impact for different people? Did everyone become a wage worker, taking the train to the factory and buying their food from stores? Did women and men have the same experiences? What was industrialization like in different parts of the world? Um, what about in rural and urban areas for people in different social classes and with different amounts of wealth? So that's what we're going to look at. So let's talk a little bit about the origins, right? The first part of this unit, the Industrial Revolution's like origin story. And we often think of this transformation as being driven by Europe. And it's true, a lot of early industrialization did happen there, especially in Britain, France, Belgium, and surrounding countries. Still, to really understand where, how, and why the Industrial Revolution began, we need to think on local and global scales at the same time. So, locally, we need to start in Great Britain. When the City of London hosted the 2012 Olympics, the theatrical opening ceremonies featured smokestacks, which you see here on the screen. And they were looming darkly over what had been a peaceful green hillside moments before. So the whether this ominous scene conveyed pride or perhaps a note of guilt, the message was clear. Industrialism started here, right? And how that happened back in the 1700s may have something to do with the British environment. Most of the British lived on one relatively flat island with easy transportation between cities and the countryside. The land provided many important industrial resources, namely coal. It also had a large population, which meant many potential factory workers. British scientists were among the earliest adopters of the rapid technological innovation needed for industrialization. They developed the first useful steam engine called the Watt steam engine. What's more, they linked other inventions to the powerful steam engine, such as the spinning mule and the power loom. The earliest railroads were built in Britain. Their cities grew fastest in the 18th century as rural residents moved there looking for work. Um, Many also moved because they were forced to. British laws were so pro industry, pro business, that land could be taken from those who worked on it, turning British farmers into hourly wage factory workers, whether they wanted to be wage workers or not. So, from this local point of view, you can see some of the reasons Britain industrialized first. The particular shape of Britain as a community mattered a great deal, but so did the larger issues surrounding the changing methods of production and distribution. So let's switch scales and think globally, with particular attention to the expanding and changing global networks. So, for example, many of the early British innovations and inventions came after similar, if less successful, experiments elsewhere. So, before the success of the Watt steam engine, Italian, Chinese, and Islamic scientists had built small steam engines of their own. In the same way, workplaces that sort of look like factories had existed elsewhere as well. In slave plantations of the British Caribbean, for example, and in flour mills in the Northeast United States. British scientists and inventors and innovators learned about these experiments in other regions and used them in their own work. So Great Britain's empire itself was a vast network and contributed to its industrialization. So laws, beliefs, and financial systems connected people in all parts of the British Empire. And these connections ended up increasing trade between Britain and its colonies. Farmers in Britain could become factory workers because they could eat food that was produced elsewhere in the British Empire. Fish from the Canadian coast or foods introduced to Britain from elsewhere, like potatoes, fed the increasing number of workers in Britain. It's no wonder fish and chips became a staple British food, right? So British factories also depended on raw materials from their colonies thousands of miles away. In particular, wool from Australia and New Zealand and cotton from India jump-started the British textile industry. So it's not like Britain did it all on their own. It clearly helped that they had an empire to draw on, right? So let's talk a little bit about the impact. Of course, we're going to go in depth on all of these things in upcoming lessons, but I'm kind of giving an overview. So, industrialization in Britain wasn't only the beginning of global industry. As we will see, the Industrial Revolution soon went global. The United States, other parts of Europe, Egypt, and Japan all industrialized in the mid to late 19th century. But industrialization was kind of lumpy. Some regions industrialized successfully, if under different models, as was the case in Japan. But in other places like Egypt and India, European imperialist policies purposely reversed or prevented them from going about complete full industrialization. This protected British producers and networks from competition from India and Egypt. The impact of industrialization varied within communities as well. For some people, industry was a miracle of productivity and rising wealth, while for other people, it brought suffering and poverty. Um, it was also often more liberating and empowering for men than for women. With women often found themselves confined either to the home or to the grim interior of a factory. So we're going to look at like what created these differences. How long did they last? How do they endure today? And these are all questions that are worth asking as we study this period. So let's talk a little bit about the origins a little bit more in detail, right? So we're going to move on, like we've moved on from the French Revolution. We're going to talk about a revolution that doesn't involve a bunch of war, and that's the Industrial Revolution. So today we're going to talk about how the Industrial Revolution began and why it did. So by the time we're done here, you should be able to describe the causes of industrialization. We will be talking a bit about each of these causes, the advancement in agriculture and farming, new energy sources, and in advancements in methods of transportation that made trade and industry much easier to facilitate. You should be able to identify which industry was the first one that industrialized on a wide scale. Spoiler alert, that's the textile industry. You should be able to explain why Great Britain led the way in the Industrial Revolution. They really were the first country to industrialize, and the rest of Europe and the US would follow, although they were not too far behind. Also, be able to identify what the Industrial Revolution actually is, define urbanization, and define all of those inventions. So, what is the Industrial Revolution? It is a period marked by the mechanization of daily life. This is where things go from being powered largely by, muscle power to being machines, powered by machines. It's generally defined as taking place between 1760 and 1870, and it's divided into two periods. The first Industrial Revolution, which we will primarily be talking about in this unit, from 1760 to 1830, and the Second Industrial Revolution, with further technological advancements, especially in transportation. It comes about later. It affects all areas. It affects transportation. It affects methods of producing goods. It affects agriculture. It affects almost everybody's daily life in a material way, in some way, shape, or form. And we will talk over the course of this unit about how that actually manifests itself. The important thing about this period of the Industrial Revolution is that it marks a major change in geography in all of these countries. It leads to urbanization, meaning people are moving to the cities to work in the factories. Before the Industrial Revolution, nearly everyone worked and lived in small farming communities. And you begin to see big cities pop up as factories are built and people go to work in those. So, what caused the Industrial Revolution? The first big cause, ironically, is changes in farming. There was something in the late 1700s called the Agricultural Revolution, which was a change in how farming was done. For many, many years, there was not a lot of thought put into farming. You just put seeds into the ground, you hoped they would get water, and you hoped they'd grow, and that was about it. Then people began to apply technology to agricultural production, to look at ways to increase crop yields, for example, to look at ways to get more food and ways to do it more quickly and more effectively and with less labor. So, some examples of that are crop rotation, which is where you change which crops you plant in a given field in a given year. And occasionally, you will give a field a year off to give the soil a chance to replenish its nutrients. Because if you use the same soil for the same thing over and over again, what's going to happen is that the soil is going to be sucked dry of all its nutrients and will eventually just turn to dust. And people in the 1700s began to realize that was a major problem. And they started implementing crop rotation to make that go away. There were also inventions such as the seed drill, which was invented by Jethro Tull. There's a picture of a seed drill here on the screen. It's something that is used to plant seeds at an even pace along a row. It allows for seeds to be planted in straighter rows, and it just makes that process much more efficient and much quicker than it would have been before. All this new technology led to more food, and as a result, there were more people because people weren't starving anymore, at least not in such large numbers. For example, in Great Britain, from the year 1700 to the year 1800, just a 100-year period, the population almost doubled. So England's population went from 5 million to 9 million in just one century. In fact, the population of Europe almost doubled as well. Now, this is going to lead to farmers being out of work because things they used to be needed for are now done by machines. And as a result, they're going to look elsewhere for work. And they end up moving into cities to work in factories that are springing up during this time. So you can see how agriculture leads to industrialization. There are also new sources of energy to power factories. At first, it was windmills and water mills. So, a water mill, that's where you put your factory on a source of running water, and the water will turn a wheel that will in turn operate the machinery. And what you begin to see being used in the early 1700s was coal, which led to the development of the steam engine. And there's a diagram here in the bottom right of how a steam engine works. You basically burn coal, which creates high pressure steam that goes into this machine and causes the pistons to move and create energy. And that really revolutionized the way factories worked. And it made it possible to build factories away from sources of water, for example. You didn't have to be on a river to make a factory anymore. The steam engine invented, or at least improved, a great deal by James Watt, which is why the watt is the unit of power, if you are familiar with scientific units. That's the other invention. There were new transportation methods that were developed during this time. The steam locomotive, or the train, was invented in the early 1800s. The first major rail line was in England. It was in the year 1830. By about 1870, railroads just went all across the United States, all across England and continental Europe. There was also the steamboat, which was largely invented by an American named Robert Fulton. And the steamboat is important because it could travel against the current, it could travel upstream. So, to use an American example, if you were in New York City, you could move goods up the Hudson River, away from the ocean and against the current by water, which was something that you just couldn't do before, right? It was very difficult to do. So this made movement of goods that were produced during industrialization much easier. Now, why Great Britain? I kind of already talked about this, but I'm going to go more in detail. So, Great Britain leads the way in industrialization. First of all, despite the fact that Britain is actually a very small country in terms of physical size, it does have a lot of natural resources, plenty of them actually. Um, Coal to power new machines, and plenty of iron to build those machines in the first place. There's also a lot of economic prosperity, largely driven by their massive amounts of colonies overseas, like in the Americas and in India, and it was also driven by slavery. There's a lot of production of goods in Great Britain and her colonies, and so upper classes, people who were wealthy and had invested in business ventures wisely, they had made money that they could pump into businesses. And mass production of goods also made it possible for everyone, even the lower classes in some cases, to buy them. Because if you have more of something, if you have more of a good, you're producing much more of it, then it's going to cost less for the customer. It's that whole supply and demand thing. And people had jobs because of industrialization. So more people had money to buy the goods. Um, Britain was also a fairly stable country. It had a great overseas trade network going all over the world. And as we mentioned in this class before, Britain also had a very strong navy, which helped it to protect its shipping and trade. So I mentioned, that textiles were the first industry that really took off during the Industrial Revolution. Demand for textiles went up a lot in the early 1700s because they were getting textiles into England from India. And it started off as what is called a cottage industry, which is industry taking place out of people's homes. And it started as something called the putting out system, where peasants would get cotton from merchants, right? And they would spin it at their houses, their own houses. And this was okay for a while, but it wasn't very efficient. And the system for producing this yarn out of cotton was really slow. And new machines came along that could produce yarn at a much faster rate. For example, the spinning jenny that you see in the picture right here. You could spin huge amounts of yarn at one time, and that leads to the creation of the first factories for widespread textile production. Because you don't need tiny little houses to do this when you have large factories that could accommodate several of these big machines to produce tons more yarn to be used to create clothes and textiles, right? So that's going to be it for this lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next one.